This is a new M2 MacBook Air, and it could be the closest thing to a perfect laptop for most people, but is it really hampered by its thermal and SSD performance? I've been using both the base model and the one with 16 gigs of RAM for a month now, and after putting them through benchmarks, battery life and thermal tests, and many hours of daily use, I have some pretty surprising findings. And to provide a better perspective, I also brought out a flagship Windows Thin and Light and also a 14-inch MacBook Pro. So let's take a look. So the Air got a new design and I like it a lot. It's all flat now instead of being a wedge shape, and overall it looks very nice and clean. There's actually not even any text markings on it. But I feel like the pursuit of the clean look might have gone a bit too far with the removal of the speaker grills. Now they're hidden in the hinge area, and they do still sound pretty good, especially against Windows devices. But I feel like firing into the hinge made the treble not as clean sounding as on the MacBook Pros, which do have top firing speaker grills. And the other new thing is the screen, and it's really nice. It's a bit larger thanks to the thin bezels. It can also go brighter now, up to 500 nits. And actually for SDR content, so like web pages, the Air is as bright as the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros because SDR content does max out at 500 nits on Apple computers. The screen also has a nice anti-reflective coating, and I've never had a problem with seeing it indoors, even when I'm sitting next to super large windows. Now outdoors, it can sometimes get hard to see, but those situations are rare. Now the screen is around 2K resolution, and at this size, you really can't see the pixels at any reasonable distance. It also is now a 10-bit panel, so it technically has nicer colors compared to last gen, but it's not super noticeable. Overall, this is definitely one of the best laptop screens. It's great to work on it, to watch content, and the slightly taller 16:10 screen feels pretty spacious for a small laptop. Alright, and I was really excited about the midnight color when I first saw the announcement. And it does look really nice. It's like a bluish black color, and it kind of changes depending on how the light hits it. But it does track fingerprints very easily. It only looks nice here because I've been constantly wiping it. So if you're thinking about going for the midnight color, just be warned of that. Now the bezels around the screen are much thinner compared to the old design, and I love the look of it. But there is a notch right in the middle. I honestly don't really mind it. I feel like you get used to it very quickly, but if you don't like it, you can very easily hide it with this app called Top Notch. Okay, and the Air finally got a 1080p webcam, and it does look really good. It's decently sharp, and there's not too much noise if the lighting is decent, and I think the built-in mic sounds pretty clear and good as well. Now, the Magic Keyboard and the Force Touch trackpad are the same as last gen, and honestly, they're among the best feeling built-in keyboard and trackpads. I especially love how the trackpad clicks uniformly everywhere. I think it's much better than the springboard type trackpad that most Windows devices still use, which is much harder to click at the top. And port-wise, so the Air now has a MagSafe port and 2 USB-C ports on one side and a headphone jack on the other. So nothing too special, but you are limited to just one external screen. I would have liked to see USB-C ports on both sides just so that there's more flexibility. And also, I honestly don't use the MagSafe that often just because many times it's just much easier to grab a USB-C cable to charge this thing. And it does fast charge through USB-C as well. But of course, the most important aspect about a laptop is how it performs. This thing isn't designed for the pros, but the speed here is actually very impressive. Both the base model and the one with 16 gigs of RAM easily outpaces even my 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro chip for some pro workloads, such as Photoshop. As you can see here, both of them are applying a filter, and the Air finishes first pretty consistently. And this is because M2 actually has better single-threaded performance than any of the M1 Pro, Max, or Ultra chips. M2 is a newer design, but it's still pretty surprising considering an M1 Max MacBook can easily cost 3 times as much. So the Air can pull ahead for most lightly threaded or shorter tasks. And that is most things most people do, and way more tasks fall into this category than you would expect. For example, I'm pretty sure all the code that I wrote in university will actually run faster on the Air than on my 14-inch MacBook Pro. And most work on the web also falls into this category. On the Speedometer Web Responsiveness Benchmark, the M2 MacBook Air scores the highest score I've seen on a laptop, and convincingly beats out the 14-inch MacBook Pro. And this does translate to real life. For example, a heavier website, such as Google Earth, finishes loading first on the M2 MacBook Air by a fairly noticeable margin. And things like this can definitely add up in a day for some noticeable time savings. So if your work is mostly shorter tasks or lightly threaded, such as most things centered around the web, photo editing, or coding that isn't about compiling huge programs, this MacBook Air is going to be faster than even a maxed out MacBook Pro. And also because this year there's a new 24 gigs of RAM option, lots of pretty complicated things can be done on the Air with no issue. Maybe things like web development, where you don't really compile too many things, but you do want to keep a ton of tabs opened. A MacBook Air could totally be sufficient for that. And not to mention that it pretty much destroys the Galaxy Book, especially when it's on battery, even with an i7 1260p with 16 gigs of RAM, so pretty top of the line for a thin and light. The MacBook Air is still 50% faster for web tasks, and 400% faster for more graphically intensive things. And not to mention that the fan on the Galaxy Book is running all the time, even when it's just playing some 4K YouTube videos. But without a fan, this MacBook Air does run into thermal limitations for longer tasks that fully load up the SoC. As you can see when rendering a video, it slows down after 5 to 6 minutes. But honestly, even when this thing is thermal throttled, it's still pretty fast. It's not going as fast as a chip could be going, but if you're not looking at the charts, you probably won't even notice that it's slowing down. After 40 minutes of benchmarking, so when the SoC is very hot and slowing down, browsing the web still feels the same as before. Everything still loads pretty much instantly. I wouldn't buy the Air mainly for rendering videos, but it's not bad at it. For a 20-minute 4K video, the Air only took 9 minutes longer than the M2 MacBook Pro, which does have a fan. Also, I am comparing the base model here, so the Air is $200 cheaper with 2 less GPU cores. So if you only occasionally render videos, you're not wasting much time at all. And actually, if you strap a small fan on the MacBook Air, you can achieve the same performance as the M2 MacBook Pro. But if these graphically intensive tasks are your main focus, then the M1 Pro MacBook Pro is quite a big step up. It has way more GPU cores and 2 fans, so it can finish the same render in less than half the time. And when it comes to the RAM, Apple Silicon devices actually feel quite different to Intel platforms. Even when this thing is out of RAM, it still loads up websites almost instantly. Here you can see me filling up the RAM to basically full, and then clicking around the web. The Mac with 8 gigs of RAM almost never needed to reload anything, or just reloaded from swaps so quickly that I didn't even notice. But the Samsung laptop here with 16 gigs of RAM is beginning to feel laggy. So if you're upgrading to an Apple Silicon device and thinking about upgrading the RAM for things like heavy web browsing, it might not be necessary at all. In fact, I don't really notice a difference between 8 and 16 gigs for daily tasks. However, partially due to the slower SSD in the base model, increasing the RAM size can make a huge difference in some situations, such as video rendering or photo exporting. So yeah, definitely would be worth the upgrade in those cases. Now, upgrading the SSD can boost the performance too, because this time the smaller one is around half the speed of the larger ones. Maybe it's due to chip shortage or cost cutting, but there's only one storage chip on the base model this year, as opposed to the typical configuration of 2. But as long as you're not heavily dependent on it for swap or transferring lots of large files to other extremely fast SSDs, you most likely won't notice a difference for most things, such as opening up an app. And most common external storage devices, so like a USB drive, an SD card, or a big hard drive, is still so much slower than the SSD in the MacBook Air. So there will be no difference when transferring files to and from those things. And surprisingly, all of this performance actually doesn't come at a cost of heat. Without a fan, the temperature at the surface and bottom of the M2 MacBook Air doesn't really get that hot. And when it's under extreme loads for over 40 minutes, it's not really any hotter than than the 14-inch MacBook Pro. It is warm, so it can definitely make your hands sweat a bit, but the surface temperature is nothing extraordinary from a laptop, reaching 45 degrees peak in the middle of the keyboard and around 35 degrees on the palm rest and trackpad areas. So yeah, overall, the M2 MacBook Air has pretty extraordinary performance for a completely silent laptop. Oh, and also the 10-core GPU upgrade. So I personally would never go for that one, just because things where the extra GPU cores can shine are typically long and heavy loads, so like video or 3D rendering, and those are tasks that the MacBook Air is the worst at. If I really need that extra bit of performance, I would definitely just go for a MacBook Pro. So unless you know that you have a particular thing that can benefit from it, I would say just go for the 8-core GPU model. And because it is Apple Silicon, if you use some not so common software, you should double check that it is supported on Apple Silicon. If it doesn't, you should still be able to run it with Rosetta, but with a performance penalty. Okay, and as for battery life. So this year, the MacBook Air actually received a larger battery, and it really closes the gap between it and the MacBook Pros. By my test, the Air will last around 14 hours and 50 minutes doing lighter tasks, such as watching some videos and web browsing. So here in my test, I had a 4K video looping, and I was also just clicking around some websites on the side. And for this, the Air performed by far the best, beating the 14-inch MacBook Pro and lasting nearly twice as long as the Samsung laptop. And the Samsung laptop actually had to run its fans just to not overheat. Both the Apple Silicon devices are super efficient, and they can last well over a day or perhaps even 2 doing these things. And when it's fully loaded, it still lasts decently, 3 hours and 48 minutes, which might seem kind of bad, but this isn't really a super realistic situation because I was looping a benchmark. So in reality, only when it's actively rendering a video or compiling a huge program would it consume this much power. But part of the reason the MacBook Air still lasted this long is because it got too hot and it needed to throttle itself, which caused it to consume less power. But that's not really a good thing here. You might be surprised that the Intel Power Samsung laptop is able to keep up, but to be honest, that's kind of a hack since it's aggressively reducing its performance when it's on battery. It only has a quarter of the performance of the Air. Now, the 14-inch MacBook Pro doesn't last that long when it's doing heavy tasks, mainly because it has fans and heat sinks that allows more power to the SoC. But of course, the MacBook Pro is going to get the tasks done much faster. So yeah, the Air definitely has very impressive battery life. But even when it dies, I can charge this thing up really quickly in around an hour with a fast charger. It can receive around 70 watts with both the MagSafe port and the USB-C. And just a quick note, so the 8-core CPU and 8-core GPU version of the Air comes with a 30-watt power adapter. So it doesn't really fast charge with this thing, but it does also come with a braided MagSafe cable that does match the color of the MacBook. So that's kind of nice. And as for the M2 MacBook Pro, so I feel like there's very little reason to get that thing because it's the same price as the Air with a GPU upgrade. And I feel like those whose work isn't really focused on rendering things wouldn't really need that upgrade. And for those who are, the 14-inch base model MacBook Pro is a much more powerful machine for $300 more. And you can also get a much better design and better screen. And for those who aren't doing rendering, it's not that easy to get the Air to overheat. And even when the Air is throttling, it's really not that slow. So if I didn't edit videos, I would definitely go for the 8-core M2 MacBook Air for $200 less, saving on the GPU and also getting the new design. Overall, the M2 MacBook Air really shouldn't be treated as just an entry-level device meant for people who aren't going to do anything demanding on their laptop. Despite its thermal and SSD limitations, it still pulls a significant lead over the latest Intel laptops and even beats my M1 Pro MacBook Pro in some common daily tasks. It delivers basically the most responsive web experience possible at any price point, while lasting very long in a package that is very thin and light. Sure, I wouldn't buy this thing specifically to edit and render videos, But other than that, it's a machine that will be very fast for a very long time to come. And with this new design, it just might be the perfect laptop for lots of people. If you enjoyed this video, then you'll probably enjoy this one too, which is about the first 10 things to do on this device. I really hope you found this video entertaining and helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any future videos from me. Here are the rest of my social media platforms, so follow me on those if you would like to. And yeah, that's all that I have to say for this video, and I really hope to see you in another one of my videos. Bye!